And President Donald Trump says China will begin purchasing U.S. soybeans and other farm goods by spring, following fresh discussions between Washington and Beijing. The announcement comes at a critical time for American farmers who were counting on China, the world's largest soybean buyer, to return to the U.S. market after months of stalled trade.
Speaking of China, since you made the deal, since you struck the deal with them, has the Chinese agreed to actually purchase any soybeans? Have they locked in any soybean purchases?
Yeah, and they're in the process of doing it. We spoke to them today. They're in the process of doing not only a little bit, but they'll be doing a lot of soybean purchase.
Do you know when? In the spring?
It's starting. Before then. I think before then. It's starting. They'll be buying a lot of soybeans, but really, Jennifer, a lot of everything else.
Africa's expanding agricultural partnership with China has become a growing focus of global attention, particularly as new soybean production projects across multiple African countries begin to reshape international supply chains. These developments are taking place against a backdrop of rising geopolitical competition, trade uncertainty, and long-standing dependence by China on soybean imports from the United States. As African soybean output grows with Chinese investment, technology, and market access, concerns have emerged within the U.S. agricultural sector about long-term market displacement and shifting global trade dynamics. Soybeans are one of the world's most strategically important agricultural commodities. They are used extensively for animal feed, cooking oil, industrial products, and biofuels. China is by far the world's largest soybean importer, accounting for more than half of global soybean imports annually. For decades, the United States has been one of China's primary suppliers, alongside Brazil. American soybean farmers built large portions of their export strategy around Chinese demand, making the relationship economically critical for rural communities across the U.S. Midwest. However, this dependence has also made U.S. farmers vulnerable to geopolitical shifts. Trade tensions between the United States and China over the past decade highlighted how quickly market access could be disrupted. Tariffs, retaliatory measures, and political uncertainty encouraged China to accelerate efforts to diversify its food supply sources and reduce reliance on any single exporting country. Africa emerged as a region of growing interest in this diversification strategy. Africa possesses vast tracts of arable land, favorable climates in many regions, and an agricultural workforce that remains underutilized in global markets. While soybean production in Africa has historically been modest compared to the Americas, output has steadily increased over the past 2 decades. Countries such as Nigeria, Zambia, Ethiopia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Mozambique have expanded soybean cultivation, driven by rising domestic demand for animal feed and vegetable oil. China's involvement in African agriculture is not new. For years, Chinese firms and development agencies have invested in irrigation systems, seed development, fertilizer production, mechanization, storage facilities, and agricultural training programs across the continent. These investments are often framed as part of broader economic cooperation, infrastructure development, and food security partnerships. Soybeans have increasingly become part of this picture as China seeks long-term supply stability. Unlike traditional extractive investments, agricultural cooperation requires sustained engagement. Chinese entities have focused on improving yields through hybrid seeds, agronomic training, and mechanized farming techniques. In some regions, demonstration farms and agricultural technology centers have been established to transfer knowledge and improve productivity. These initiatives aim to close the yield gap between African farms and global averages, which remains significant. African governments have shown growing interest in soybean expansion for several reasons. Soybeans improve soil fertility through nitrogen fixation, making them attractive in crop rotation systems. They also support domestic livestock industries by providing a local source of protein feed, reducing dependence on imports. In addition, soybeans offer export potential at a time when many African countries are seeking to diversify away from raw mineral exports and build agricultural value chains. China's market access provides an additional incentive. For African producers, access to a large, stable beer can help justify investment in large-scale production and processing facilities. Some agreements involve off-take arrangements, where buyers commit to purchasing a portion of future output, reducing market risk for producers. This model contrasts with the volatility many African farmers face when relying solely on spot markets. From the U.S. perspective, the expansion of soybean production in Africa raises strategic concerns. American farmers have already faced increased competition from Brazil, which has overtaken the United States as China's largest soybean supplier in recent years. The possibility that Africa could emerge as another alternative source amplifies fears of long-term market erosion. Even if African soybeans do not immediately replace U.S. exports, gradual diversification could permanently reduce America's share of the Chinese market. U.S. agricultural groups have warned that losing export markets can have lasting consequences. Soybean farming operates on thin margins, and export demand plays a crucial role in pricing. Reduced access to major buyers can depress domestic prices, affecting farm incomes, land values, and rural economies. For many farmers, the concern is not an immediate collapse but a slow decline as global buyers adjust sourcing strategies. China's interest in African soybeans also reflects broader food security concerns. With a large population and limited arable land, China has long prioritized stable access to agricultural imports. Climate change, extreme weather, and geopolitical uncertainty have reinforced the need for diversified supply chains. Investing in multiple producing regions helps mitigate risks associated with droughts, floods, or political disruptions in any single supplier country. For Africa, the expansion of soybean farming presents both opportunities and challenges. Increased production can create jobs, raise incomes, and support agro-industrial development. Processing soybeans locally into oil, meal, and finished products adds value and reduces reliance on imports. However, large-scale agricultural expansion also raises questions about land use, environmental sustainability, and inclusion of smallholder farmers. Land governance remains a sensitive issue in many African countries. Ensuring that local communities benefit from agricultural investments requires clear land rights, transparent contracts, and strong regulatory oversight. Governments face the challenge of attracting foreign investment while protecting farmers from displacement or exploitation. The structure of China-Africa agricultural partnerships varies widely by country and project, making generalizations difficult. Environmental considerations are also increasingly important. Soybean expansion in other parts of the world has been linked to deforestation and biodiversity loss. African policymakers and investors face pressure to avoid repeating these patterns. Sustainable intensification, rather than extensive land conversion, is often promoted as the preferred approach. Whether this goal can be achieved at scale remains an open question. Despite these complexities, Africa's soybean sector continues to grow. Production volumes remain far below those of the United States or Brazil, but the trajectory is upward. Improvements in infrastructure, including roads, railways, and ports, many of which involve Chinese financing, enhance the feasibility of exporting agricultural products. Reduced transportation costs can significantly improve competitiveness in global markets. The geopolitical implications of these developments extend beyond agriculture. China-Africa cooperation in food production reinforces broader economic ties, including trade, investment, and diplomatic alignment. For African countries, diversifying partnerships reduces dependence on any single external actor. For China, deeper engagement strengthens its position as a long-term development partner rather than just a commodity bear. The United States, meanwhile, faces strategic choices. Maintaining competitiveness in global agriculture may require renewed focus on trade diplomacy, market diversification, and domestic support for farmers. Some analysts argue that relying too heavily on one export market created vulnerabilities that are now becoming apparent. Others emphasize the need for innovation, sustainability, and value-added production to remain competitive. It is important to note that Africa's soybean expansion does not necessarily imply a zero-sum outcome. Global demand for soybeans continues to grow, driven by population growth, rising meat consumption, and biofuel production. In theory, increased supply from Africa could complement existing producers rather than replace them entirely. However, market dynamics are shaped by price, logistics, and political relationships, all of which influence sourcing decisions. For U.S. farmers, perception matters as much as reality. The idea that China is actively developing alternative suppliers feeds uncertainty and anxiety, even if the immediate impact on export volumes is limited. Agricultural markets are forward-looking, and expectations about future demand influence planning decisions, investment, and pricing. African policymakers increasingly emphasize food sovereignty and value chain development. Producing soybeans for export is often linked to domestic objectives such as livestock feed production and edible oil self-sufficiency. Balancing export ambitions with domestic needs will shape how the sector evolves. If managed effectively, soybean expansion could strengthen food systems rather than undermine them. China's role in this process will continue to be scrutinized. Supporters argue that Chinese investment fills gaps left by Western donors and accelerates development. Critics caution against over-reliance on any single partner and stress the importance of local ownership and transparency. As with many aspects of China-Africa relations, outcomes depend heavily on governance, policy choices, and implementation at the national level. The global soybean market is entering a period of transition. Climate pressures, shifting diets, geopolitical competition, and technological change are reshaping production and trade patterns. Africa's growing role reflects these broader trends rather than a single strategic decision. Nevertheless, the symbolism of China turning to Africa for soybeans resonates strongly in the context of U.S.-China rivalry. For American farmers, the situation underscores the interconnected nature of global agriculture. Decisions made thousands of miles away can influence prices, incomes, and livelihoods at home. For African producers, new opportunities bring both promise and responsibility. For China, diversification represents insurance against uncertainty in an increasingly volatile world. As Africa continues to develop its agricultural potential, the long-term consequences will unfold gradually. Whether African soybean farms become a major pillar of global supply or remain a supplementary source will depend on investment levels, productivity gains, policy frameworks, and environmental constraints. What is clear is that the global agricultural landscape is no longer static, and traditional exporters can no longer assume permanent dominance. The emergence of Africa as a more active player in soybean production illustrates how global power shifts are increasingly reflected in food systems. Agriculture, once seen primarily as a domestic concern, has become a strategic arena where economics, politics, and development intersect. The reactions of U.S. farmers highlight the human dimension of these shifts, reminding observers that behind trade statistics are communities navigating uncertainty. In this evolving context, cooperation and competition coexist. Africa's partnership with China in agriculture reflects pragmatic choices shaped by opportunity and necessity. For the United States, adapting to a multipolar agricultural world may prove just as important as defending existing markets. The story of soybeans, often viewed as a simple crop, now offers a window into the changing dynamics of global power, trade, and development. If you care about real African stories and global impact, subscribe to this channel. Africa Press Room brings you informed, in-depth stories that matter. Stay connected, stay informed.